of our series of 5 Saturday afternoons. I figured that if we did something in the winter, it would be more weather-free than it would be to do it outdoors at the cemetery. So our first Saturday afternoon event got canceled because of the snowstorm 2 weeks ago. And today's happened by the skin of its teeth. Yeah. Because the gas for this building stopped last night. And so there was no heat here until a little around 11 o'clock this morning. So, if not, we would have sat here in your coats and I might as well have been in the cemetery. But I'm Rob Gregg, president of Vine Lake Preservation Trust. And we have this series of Saturday afternoons for today and the next 3 sessions every other week, designed to introduce you to Legends and Legacies of Vine Lake Cemetery, which is on Main Street, headed west out of town. But today's session is about the causes of death in Medfield burieds, starting in 1745 up until around 1865. And over the course of the next hour, we will take a look at 12 persons who are buried in the cemetery, and I will give you a little background as to who they were, and if I knew where they lived, I'll tell you that. But the major part of the presentation will be done by Sam Foreman, who is a physician, historically interested, and has presented in walking tours here at Vine Lake Cemetery before. And I will let Sam introduce himself and to launch into the topic of causes of death. Sam.
Thank you. I'm always delighted to trek down from Brookline, where I live, to Medfield. And I actually got to meet and befriend Rob several years ago, unexpectedly. I am the biographer of the American founder Joseph Warren, the hero of Bunker Hill and the fellow who sent Paul Revere on that midnight ride. And while I was researching the book, I was interested to know more about his fiancée, Joseph Warren's fiancée, Miss Mercy Scully, who was a daughter of liberty in the spirit of Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams and those folks. And I found that she was virtually unknown and is a resident in Medfield, more specifically in Vine Lake. So I came out to visit her grave. Turned out I think I was about the first person in a century to make this trek to find her grave, and I could not find it. So of course, in such a situation, you end up talking to the go-to person about anything and everything related to Vine Lake. And I was fortunate to meet up with Mr. Gregg, who pointed out her stone. I'm not going to talk about Miss Mercy Scully, though I do recommend that folks learn about your own daughter of liberty, who lived the last several decades of her life here in Medfield. But rather, I'm going to talk about some aspects of 18th and 19th century medicine. Dr. Joseph Warren, the Revolutionary War hero, is known for his politics and his military exploits at Bunker Hill. But in fact, he was a physician for all of his life, except for the last few months. And so in writing his biography, I, by necessity, needed to become an authority on 18th century medicine, and on the way, 19th century medicine. So I'm probably one of the few physicians in Massachusetts that's capable of making 18th century house calls. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless you're into bleeding and other such things. So the idea of looking at folks' lives, the totality of their lives, including the end of their lives, in the actual original context, kind of brought Rob and me together, and the kernel with him of the idea for this talk. And that is taking some residents, as he's prone to call them, of the cemetery, and looking at their experience through their last days, if you will, their causes of death. And through that, gaining an appreciation not only of their individual lives from this aspect, but learning some about health and medicine in Medfield in the time of your predecessors 150 to 200 years ago. So let's talk a little bit about medicine in Massachusetts and how it was likely to be practiced here. Now, this topic itself could be the entire lecture, and I'm not going to bore you with that. But let me just share with you a few facts and observations to frame the specific discussions of the people we're going to talk about today. Okay, first of all, medicine in mid to late 18th century Massachusetts, including a place like Medfield. How would you become a doctor? Any ideas? Yes?
Harvard.
Harvard. Harvard did not have a medical school until 1782, so the answer is no. Although some of the best physicians in Massachusetts did graduate at Harvard College, but beyond, and there was a club there, legendary club. The records don't survive, but we know it existed. It was called the Spunkers. The Spunkers was a club of undergraduates, of aspiring physicians. The chief challenge of the Spunkers and their surviving letters, which include a future governor of Massachusetts, so some credibility there, was that it was illegal to obtain bodies for anatomical study. So the Spunkers spent a disproportionate amount of their time. It wasn't illegal actually to study cadavers. It was illegal to obtain them. So they spent a lot of their time basically acquiring dead bodies for study. This activity has a formal name, resurrectionists. And in the 19th century, especially in fiction, there's some outrageous stories of how people acquired bodies by helping them become dead bodies in England. In Massachusetts, nothing like that exactly happened, but the aspiring physicians themselves had a lot of daring do in visiting cemeteries. This apparently did not happen in Medfield, but closer to Boston. Looking for folks who were recently deceased and didn't have a lot of family, perhaps were executed for a crime, and they were candidates, if you will, to help these physicians study medicine. Well, the three ways were you could apprentice yourself to a willing physician who had an excellent background in the community. One, apprenticeship. Number two is if mommy and daddy were well off, you can talk them into sending you to a prestigious European medical school to become a physician in England or Scotland, and occasionally Holland and France, if you had the languages. You'd come back, and that was the most prestigious kind of physician in the 18th and early 19th century, European-trained physician. And then the third way was to hang up a shingle and say, I'm a physician. And if people came to you, that was the proof of it. Now, if there are libertarians around here, I don't know if you have people like that politically in Medfield or would admit to it in public, but that is basically a libertarian philosophy. You know, you don't have licensure. You don't have intrusive government telling you who a physician is or who a nurse is. if you are a physician, people come to you, that is the proof of it. So that was the three kinds of physicians. Now the first two kinds looked down on the self-appointed physicians, but in fact there were some rather good ones who were self-trained. And they were able to exist because there weren't very many formal training opportunities, even when medical schools came along. The first medical school in the United States was down in Philadelphia, and Benjamin Franklin had some to do with it. The Medical College of Pennsylvania dates to 1759. But none of those graduates wandered up north until late in the 18th century. And the first medical school in New England was Harvard, 1782. So, these apprentice-trained physicians practiced well into the 19th century and almost all of the 18th century. I have not studied the physicians practicing in the Medfield area in the late 18th century, but for sure, whoever it was would have come from one of those three backgrounds. Okay. Yes?
What kind of doctor was Dr. Warren?
Dr. Warren, the specialization of medicine at the time wasn't as sharply defined as it is today.
I meant, what was his training?
Yes, his training was as an apprentice to Dr. James Lloyd. Dr. James Lloyd was a physician of excellent reputation, but also a notorious Tory from a political standpoint, who practiced from about 1760 to when he died around 1803. Lloyd was trained in London hospitals and had a general practice which was very strong in surgery and had a significant obstetrical aspect of it as well. So he was the most prominent physician in Boston and all of Massachusetts at the time. So Joseph Warren, when he graduated medical school in 1759, 2 years later landed a very prestigious apprenticeship with Dr. Lloyd. The apprenticeships were typically 2 years in length, and you paid a tuition of £100, Massachusetts, to your mentor. So Joseph Warren was an apprentice, trained physician, Harvard undergraduate. A couple of words about the content of medicine. I did mention the kinds of medical practice were not sharply defined as they are today. If you have an appendix problem, you go to a surgeon, right? If you have a problem with high blood pressure, you go to your internist or your family doctor. The practices in 18th and early 19th century especially were more general practices, what we would call family practice, but would generally include surgery and obstetrics as well. So it would include more than even most family practitioners deal with now. Some of the practice lean more towards one or the other. Dr. Joseph Warren's colleague, Dr. Benjamin Church, who's also our first national traitor, but as a physician, his practice leaned more towards surgery. So it made sense that he be the first Surgeon General of the Continental Army, responsible presumably for battle casualties. Joseph Warren's practice leaned more towards what we would call general internal medicine, medications, diagnosis, that kind of thing. Although he did do some surgery and some obstetrics. A little bit about the content of medical care. Well into the 19th century, throughout the period we're going to talk about today, the content of medicine was heavily dependent on the humoral theory, which dated back to ancient times. That would describe diseases in terms of the four humors and imbalances amongst the four humors. So a lot of the treatments would be involved with restoring the balance of the humors. Do any of you know what the four humors are or were? blood. You had too much blood, you had a sanguine personality. Yellow bile. Too much yellow bile, you can see it in your eyeballs. They're yellow. Jaundiced. Yellow bile. Black bile. Melancholy. Black humor. Choly means humor. So that root word, choler, comes from humors. And of course, phlegm. If you had too much phlegm, you were phlegmatic. So they survive more in the language now than anything else. Although when I go to the crunchy health stores around Boston, I don't know if you have any around here, the humoral theories seem to survive in the description of some of these remedies. In fact, a lot of the herbs that are recommended in health food shops were in mainstream medical use in the late 18th century and early 19th century, based on the humoral theory. And the humoral theory itself dates back to ancient Greece and Rome and the ancient physicians. So things like, things that are good for dissipating the melancholy. Chamomile, tincture of chamomile. That's mainstream medicine in this time frame. You might drink it in tea now. If you have a respiratory problem with phlegm, you might be using menthol. Or if you weren't using anything quite so powerful, honey. All of these things will show up in cough drops. Now, it's mainstream medical care in the 18th and 19th century based on humoral theory. Of course, the surgical stuff of setting broken bones and that sort of thing was pretty straightforward, although they didn't have any notion of bacteria or infectious diseases in the way we think of bacteria, viruses, and certain funguses that could cause disease. They would look at the same disease and think about it in terms of the four humors. And we're going to talk some examples for that. So anyway, I'm running at the mouth here, but to give you a little taste for medicines. Now we're going to get a lot more specific. We are.
When we look at the 12 candidates for our discussion today, each of them has a very prescribed cause of death. And the citation that is used in our discussion today to their cause of death are all documented in vital records. And that's one of the reasons we chose them, because we know exactly what their cause of death was. So we rely heavily on the vital records of Medfield to the year 1850 to help us identify what the causes of death are. Our first subject today, or our candidate, is Benjamin Pickman Derby, who is buried in the cemetery. He was the third child of Elias Haskett and Mary Ann Allen Derby. His older brother Richard Crowninshield Derby died at Antietam in 1862, and his sister Sarah Ellen Derby Rogers died in 1917. All five of these family members are buried in one particular lot in the cemetery, and each of those persons lived at one point in time in the Dwight Derby house in Medfield. Sam will tell you about the cause of death.
Cholera. See that word, choler? Excess of bile, black bile in this case. A disease coming on suddenly and involving massive diarrhea and vomiting. death could ensue within a day or two of contracting it. The cause of death in this time period was specifically unknown. It was thought to be something associated with the environment, perhaps the water supply, that disrupted the humors very acutely. Now, a cholera epidemic was raging in different places in the world around this time. There were two major cholera epidemics, and even without laboratory confirmation that we might consider expected nowadays, the signs and symptoms of cholera, untamed cholera, are so dramatic that there was little concern of a misdiagnosis at the time. And in fact, even historically, looking backwards, we have no doubt that this was cholera. That is, massive dehydration in a very short period of time, plus or minus nausea and vomiting. The stools themselves, and forgive me if I'm going to be too explicit right after lunch, so I'll tone it down. But at any rate, the stool itself is not what you might expect of stuff coming out of your gastrointestinal tract. There'd be so much fluid lost that the what would come out would resemble white rice fluid, which is how they would describe it. Still described in the textbook that way. And what it is just a massive loss of fluid. And in modern terms, electrolytes like sodium and potassium and other things. And also some of the lining of your intestines, which is just being destroyed and being sloughed off. There was some research in London just a couple of years before this child passed away to indicate that indeed cholera was passed by water. An astute physician who also was the personal physician to Queen Victoria noticed that in London, the outbreak of cholera there, and there were epidemics from about the late 1820s into the early 1840s, all around the world, actually. But he noticed that the striking of cholera in London was very patchy. Certain neighborhoods would have a lot of cases and others had none at all. And he could trace it to the communal pumps in London. And in those days in London, there were commercial water companies. Now, you didn't have like the town of Medfield Public Works Water Company. No, you had competing water companies in London. And the Porter and Vauxhall, which is sort of a scary sounding name, company, drew its water downstream in the Thames River, and the people whose pumps were supplied by the Porter and Vauxhall Company had the cholera, and the competing companies drawing their water upstream in the Thames had virtually none. There was something involved in polluted water. Now, it wasn't until decades later that people really associated specific bacteria with disease, but the notion that there was something in foul water that passed the cholera was getting to be known. In fact, some of the wonderful public works projects of getting pure water to Boston and other cities in Massachusetts has its origin in the 1850s, when this realization that pure water was a way to a community's health, and conversely, not so pure water was associated with outbreaks of disease like the cholera. The cholera in 1842 in Medfield had no effective treatment. although I'm sure the physicians tried. But in fact, the massive dehydration and loss of electrolytes at a time when they didn't even know what an electrolyte was in the body could not be replaced fast enough. And usually the people had their constitutions basically collapsed and died very rapidly. Sometimes entire families were wiped out by this. Now, I don't know in this particular family whether any personal letters and diaries survive, but you could just imagine the personal loss and impact on a family that beloved people would go from being a vibrant youth to being dead in days would have. So we can only guess in this case. The modern explanation, cholera is caused by a bacteria called Vibrio cholera, which is a gram-negative bacillus that's passed by the ingestion of sewage. It still occurs in the third world, and if our own water supply system were disrupted, we could see it again. Now, if we did see it, though, there is pretty effective treatment of massive oral ingestion of fluids with electrolytes that could actually save people in the acute phase. And this is done regularly now in the third world, that even if you're stricken with cholera, you could be treated with fairly simple means of massive rehydration, kind of like Gatorade on steroids, that will save you in the acute phase of a couple of days, get you over it, and then the disease burns out on its own, and you're okay. They didn't know that back then. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I often ask people if they know the name of more people who were buried in the cemetery than any other. And they sit and think for a little while and they come up with names. But the answer is Smith. Pretty obvious. So we take a look at Daniel Smith, who died at age 42. Not much is known about him beyond the cause of death that Sam will tell you about. He was born the second of 6 children to Deacon Jeremiah and Anna Russell Smith. And here is his cause of death.
This is not funny to Mr. Smith. Epilepsy. I don't know if any of you in the room have it or know people who have it. But what it is, and this is a modern explanation, right? Not a period explanation. Modern explanation is that there's some damage to the nerve cells in your central nervous system that unpredictably have them fire off in a way that has all the rest of the neurons in your head firing or misfiring at the same time. So people will drop down, lose consciousness, have fitful motions of their musculature, which make no sense. They're just vibrating, eyes rolling back in their head. And this could last a few minutes. And then after an epileptic fit, untreated, you will recover. The individual often is in a daze for a while, and then is fully recovered. Now, the kind of damage that would cause epilepsy in the brain varies a lot. I would say maybe a majority of cases now are of unknown cause. Some of it, though, where causes are known, are related to trauma. Someone was hit in the head at some point, and apparently their brain didn't heal fully. So a little scar tissue in the brain can misfire in that way, unpredictably. There's other instances where certain infections that have affected the brain leave someone with epilepsy. Drug reactions of a very particularly bad nature can do this. Like I say, majority of epilepsy cases are of unknown origin. The ones that occur from childhood are a lot of the cases, and in modern times, there are medications that can prevent these errant nerve cells from misfiring, or if they do, kind of tamp down the recruitment of other nerve cells to cause a full-fledged fit. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that nowadays, most people with epilepsy lead particularly normal lives, except they may take these medications, unbeknownst to most of their friends, and have a normal life, basically. However, in the 18th and 19th century, that would not necessarily be the case. They didn't have effective medicines that could suppress the fits. So if they happened, you would know it. So your family and neighbors would know if you were epileptic. And sometimes there was death and or major sequela or follow-up that would happen just because the person would have a fit, and if they happened to be eating at the time or fell down in the wrong way, their own tongues and things in their mouth could get in the way of their breathing during a fit. So those of you actually who have taken first aid courses may recall that if you're there and observe someone with an epileptic fit, they train you in ways basically to keep the mouth open, keep the air so the person can breathe, right? So and it's very effective, right? The person will breathe, the fit will play its course, and the person will feel kind of woozy and get up and be none the worse for wear. However, if they lose their ability to breathe during the fit, then they could die. Or, if they happen to be bending over a well, getting a bucket of water at the time, now since in the 19th century, the epilepsy have been a chronic disease. We have no idea, because we don't know too much about this person's life, how they acquired the epilepsy, whether it was one of these unknown things from childhood, whether he had some trauma at some point and had epilepsy after that. That we don't know. But it must have been known enough to his neighbors that this guy would drop down into fits sometime, that when an otherwise healthy person fell down a well, that it was probably this and had the official attribution. It's even possible that he was standing next to somebody when it happened at a well, who actually saw the fit and watched him drop down and just couldn't get to him in time. Now, the person having the fit, while they're having the fit, is not conscious, right? So if you fall, head down into a well, you don't have more than a minute or so to get above the water, right? And you yourself are not conscious, so you're going to depend on bystanders. So that even if there were a bunch of people around the well at the same time, they might not have gotten to him in time. Or perhaps he was alone when it happened, and just given the history of epilepsy, folks pieced this together as the official cause. Either way, he's a resident at your cemetery.
Our next subject is Gertrude Madonna Barney, who died at age 3 in 1845. She was the first of 4 children, born to Thomas Lyman and Mary Mann Smith Barney. Her 1-year-old brother George died in 1852. Her 7-month-old sister died in 1855 from congestion of the lungs. It is presumed that this family lived at a home on South Street, which still stands today. It's number 47 South Street, and if you know where I live, it's diagonally across the street. Gertrude Madonna Barney dies in 1845 at age 3 from this cause.
Croup. Croup, an infectious disease, worse in the wintertime. Upper airway inflammation, causing narrowing of the breathing tubes. And untreated, as the breathing tube gets narrower and narrower, causes an unearthly sound as the stricken individual is gasping for air. This is an unfortunately common cause of death in young children in this time period. The treatments at that time in modern parlance were completely ineffective. A modern treatment, well, first of all, modern is a preventive. There's a particular organism discovered decades and decades after this particular situation. It's called Corynebacterium diphtheriae, and it's the D in the DPTs that you have in children's standard set of immunizations. So this is particularly rare in a preventive nature now, and those cases that clinically occur now are most often caused by viruses and what have you. There's very effective treatments as well. Supplemental oxygen, if the airway is completely blocked, even a tracheostomy tube if necessary. Antibiotics, which can tamp down opportunistic bacteria and make it worse. So basically, even now, most of the croup never occurs due to preventive measures. Although there's a significant group of parents in different parts of the country who, for various reasons, do not want their children immunized. In fact, there's an outbreak of mumps that has been associated with folks, with parents not having their children immunized and giving the opportunity for these diseases to come back.
It's
yes?
measles.
Is it measles? Okay. To the extent that parents would not give their children the DPT immunization series, it gives the opportunity for this to come back. Now, if it did come back, though, we have effective treatments for it, and it wouldn't have the kind of mortality that it did back then. Childhood mortality in general in Medfield and all of Massachusetts is very high in the 18th and 19th century. I mean, almost unthinkable today, but you're talking about 20% or more of children never making it out of the single-digit ages. And that's standard. So although it is a heartache to all the families, almost all families would either have children who passed away of these kind of infectious diseases, or your neighbors would. So this is part of life, and a difficult life. Thank you.
Nathan Clark was the first of 10 children born to David and Mary Smith Clark. Not much is known of him, but his cause of death.
Consumption. Chronic tuberculosis becoming fatal. Tuberculosis is a particularly common chronic disease in this time period. Folks would have it, and the symptoms with chronic productive cough, sometimes productive of blood-tinged sputum, was distinctive, as would be the weight loss attached to it. So although they did not have knowledge of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that you would look at under the microscope, which physicians started to do by the late 19th century, the symptoms were chronic and particularly distinctive that people would know they had consumption or tuberculosis. It would last years. Typically, the course of untreated tuberculosis would be to get worse, stabilize, sometimes even improve a little bit, and then unexpectedly get worse again. So you could have consumption, tuberculosis, for decades, even. And if you had it, although it was your death sentence, you wouldn't know whether it would be 3 months from now or 20 years from now. There was no notion that it was infectious. And it is infectious, incidentally, in modern terms, but not terribly so. So you could live in a house with someone with consumption. Some people will get it, some won't. Today, even today, we don't even know why. But it's a low-grade infectious chronic disease that had no effective treatment in those days. So this individual may have had consumption for years until it finally did him in. There were treatments for consumption in the humoral mode that I talked about, but would have not, from a modern standpoint, changed the course of the disease.
Just as a footnote, the leading cause of death in Medfield in 1846 was consumption. Caroline Partridge Stevens, aged 30 years, died in 1849. She was the second of 3 children born to Henry and Anna Babcock Partridge. She married in 1846 the Reverend Daniel Waldo Stevens, who became, after that, the first Unitarian minister on Martha's Vineyard. 3 months before her death, in 1849, she gave birth to their only child, Daniel.
In the medicine of Medfield in this time frame, 18th century as well, since the underlying causes were completely unknown and in the future, illnesses were often described by their chief symptom. And this looks very quaint to us today, but I think that's not fair to project current knowledge onto the past in that way. But a major condition could be fever. Listed by the physicians, they're treating fever. You might die of fever, right? Whereas we're talking about, why do you have a fever? Right? Is it pneumonia? Is it this, that, right? So we're looking at causes where they just say fever. Anemia is like that as well. We're thinking anemia, what happens? The person bled out, did they have cancer, or did they have some blood disease that's causing them to be anemic? No, the diagnosis is anemia. And so we don't know what exactly this is in modern terms. I could take 2 guesses and that it would remain. First of all, you don't have laboratory tests like we do now, or even were developed 100 years ago in this time frame. By a laboratory test, I mean like measuring the hematocrit, which is the amount of red blood cells in the blood. No, they don't have that. They don't even know what's normal. They're probably just bleeding somebody, taking the blood, putting it up to the light, and if it looks kind of too pink than regular blood, well, then that's anemic. That's probably how this diagnosis was made. Now, this lady gave birth several months before. A plausible scenario would be that she had excessive bleeding at the time of birth that left her anemic and set up for some opportunistic disease on top of that, a bacterial disease perhaps, and that did her in. Alternatively, at this age, she might, coincidentally to the pregnancy, because a lot of women this age were getting pregnant a lot, was that she had something like a blood cancer, like as the kind they would have treated Dana-Farber, right? That made her anemic. The anemia, perhaps the doctors noticed by this gross looking at the blood, but in fact, she may have had her hematologic system trashed by a cancer and died from some complication of that. Leukemias of certain types are relatively more common in young women and men, or youngish women and men. So that's a possibility as well. Now, even the idea of leukemia, a cancer of the blood, is something that was discovered decades and decades later. But of course, people had these conditions before they were even known, and the way they were known was just by this sort of basket title for lots of different things, anemia. That's about as far as I can take this one.
Another familiar name to the early history of Medfield, Dwight's. This is Seth Dwight. He was born the last of 8 children to Captain John and Elizabeth Harding Dwight. He was active, like his father, in town affairs, and for a number of years he was the town treasurer and served as a selectman here in Medfield. His cause of death is one of the few examples in the cemetery where you will see the cause of death as part of the inscription on his stone.
Smallpox is the great scourge of the 18th century, occurring in periodic epidemics, including from about 1775 to 1777. It was such a big deal that it actually figured in to some of the battle strategies of the Continental Army fighting the Revolutionary War. But it was not just in North America. The smallpox knew no boundaries, and records studied in more modern times show that Indian tribes out in the West, virtually unknown territory, were suffering this epidemic. The Spanish colonials in the Southwest, the Caribbean, and in other parts of the world. Sufficient amount of world trade and contact, even at that time period, to be passing the smallpox around very widely. Unlike some of these other diseases, there was effective approaches to smallpox in this time frame. Inoculation, so preventive measure of taking live smallpox from someone who is stricken and deliberately injecting that to a person who's never had smallpox. The resulting smallpox, deliberately planted smallpox, had a much lower mortality than if you caught it from what they call the wild type. So this is a rather striking example of relatively effective treatments, even in the absence of knowledge that came decades, centuries later, of what the infectious virus, the variola virus, was behind smallpox. This was all based on empirical knowledge that once you got smallpox, you were immune for life, and that the deliberately planted smallpox was less of a problem than if you caught it wild. Incidentally, we don't even know for sure why, even now, that was true. But they kept statistics pretty well of this in Boston, which had major inoculation campaigns in the around 1755, 1764, and the deliberately planted inoculation was 1/20th as fatal as if you caught it wild. So, and then there were isolation hospitals for people who had these immunizations. A number of individuals were involved in this at the time. The diaries of Abigail Adams chronicles her decisions to have her child inoculated and just how that occurred over a period of months. Because you're actually going to have smallpox right now. But imagine the different mindset. You as a parent decide to have your child inoculated. The inoculation has a 1 to 3% mortality itself. Right? You're deliberately going to inoculate the kid, and you know they have a 1 to 3% chance of dying from that. Versus if you just let them go on their own and they catch smallpox, 20 to 25% mortality. Some of you who may remember from science class in high school or whatever, that the most definitive treatment came in about 1798, and that would be inoculated with cowpox. Not smallpox, but cowpox. Related disease, but basically not fatal at all. That was introduced in London, or in England, around 1798 by Dr. Jenner. It was very rapidly picked up and adopted in Massachusetts. So by the time of the early 1800s, this inoculation for smallpox, which was pretty risky in itself, had been displaced by the almost entirely effective inoculation with cowpox, which effectively wiped out smallpox as an issue in Medfield and everywhere else in Massachusetts in this time frame. However, this is the 1777 time frame, and this fellow succumbed to, in hindsight, what was a worldwide outbreak of smallpox during the early part of the Revolutionary War.
Another familiar Medfield name today, Charles Abbott Bullard, or Charlie, as he was known in his family, died in 1848. He was the third and last child of John Elijah and Eliza Ann Cole Bullard. He lived 10 months and 24 days and had a most remarkable cause of death.
I had mentioned that childhood mortality is very high. Children under 1, 10% or more, never make it to their first year. And the causes of death for that in modern times sometimes are not known precisely, because the physicians themselves would say it was teething. And by that, they apparently meant that the baby would not nurse well, had a failure to thrive, and died. Now, it wasn't just docs in the boonies in Medfield doing this, having this approach. Joseph Warren's younger brother, John Warren, was trained by Joseph Warren, and in his time became the most prominent physician in Massachusetts, John Warren. John Warren founded Harvard Medical School in 1782, co-founded the Massachusetts Medical Society, publisher of the Mass New England Journal of Medicine, the most prestigious medical journal in the world. He had a big family himself. Between his own children and the adopted orphans of Revolutionary War hero Joseph Warren, about 15 or 16 kids in his household. Several of them never made it beyond 1 or 2 years old. He listed their cause of death as teething. So it's like mainstream thinking. Modern thinking is that it's probably a basket load of childhood diseases that had the final common denominator that the child lost interest in nursing. And mind you, you're at a time where you can't replace it with intravenous fluids and don't have stuff like that. And not thought of. And so if it was the mother's issue with nursing, if you could afford it, you might get a wet nurse. But if it was the baby themselves, for whatever reason, not taking in nutrition and would waste away and die, that was called teething. But in modern terms, could be anything that would involve a child not taking sustenance and failure to thrive. That term is still used, actually, failure to thrive. But usually it's just in terms of a baby not growing as fast or reaching their milestones as fast as you might expect them to. That's called failure to thrive. I guess that's the similar kind of concept of a basket type of word that doesn't really mean very much when you get close to it. But those babies in modern times who fail to thrive are not expected to die. But in this time frame, they were. Teething is a listed cause of death, not an infrequent one, and including some of the major healthcare practitioners of the time frame in their own family. Teething.
Much of our subject matter today, as Sam referred to, deals with children. Only because many of the causes of death are quite remarkable, and are causes back then which are not prevalent today. So it makes a dramatic point of view. But Elias Mann Fisk was 3 years old when he died in 1837. He was the third of 8 children born to George and Ann Plimpton Mann Fisk. He and his sister died of the same illness 3 weeks apart.
Another childhood infectious disease, usually occurring in epidemic portions, highly infectious from one to another. So you have these sad situations of multiple people dying within the same family. The young, especially susceptible to this kind of thing. It's, in modern terms, it's a complication of a Staphylococcus aureus infection, which is a bacteria infection, taking root in the body and evident clinically, even without laboratory cultures and what have you, by distinctive blotches and spots that are scarlet-teniform rash that doctors are even told to look out for now. That is a sign that the bacteria has invaded the body. The actual cause of death could come several ways as to which body system collapses under this onslaught. From being a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed child to the high fever, rash, and death, like some of these other conditions, could have been a matter of days.
Harriet Adams White, another child, 1 week shy of her 2nd birthday. died in 1830. She was the second of 12 children born to Orion and Charlotte Adams White. And I'll just make a comment about her memorial. This is a very modern memorial, and it is because it is made out of polished granite. And that was not available in 1830 at the time she died, as well as a number of her other siblings and parents. But resident in the cemetery today are a number of replacement memorials that later on in life the family decided to consolidate the memorials that were there, or to add ones that were never there in the first place. And the White family did that, at a time that we don't know when they did it. But this is how you make sense of somebody dying in 1830 and taking a look at a memorial that is clearly in the last century. But she had an interesting cause of death.
One of the most common causes of death in young girls in the 18th century and first half of the 19th century was scalding, where many young girls had no formal schooling, but were expected to help around the household on their way to being domestics themselves at a time when they were old enough to marry and what have you. But before gas ranges or even cast iron coal ranges came into vogue, and I think the cast iron things were probably all the rage in about 1850 to 60 and came into more common use in the later 19th century. Before that, you're talking about open fireplace cooking, so that all the folks, parents, probably more heavily mothers with the division of labor, being a much more traditional kind of way, and the girl offspring working in the kitchen, laboring, preparing meals, which is quite laborious to do in open hearth kind of cooking, would be exposed literally to open fires. And the styles were long dresses and aprons, and they didn't have, like these handy fire extinguishers. You might have a bucket of sand or a bucket of water, maybe. And so embers, coming out of the cooking area, or a cauldron of boiling, oil being made into candles or soap or something. If that spills on you, you're in a world of hurting. And then treatment of burns from hot oil or from actual fire was primitive at best. There was no skin transplanting or anything like that. If a burn was bad enough to expose the underlying skin, you're going to be prey to bacteria that are going to get you, if not immediately, within days to weeks. So to make a long story short, a scalding bad enough to be fatal, either directly or by its complications, is a common cause of death in young girls.
We move on to another family of children, only because these are quite remarkable in their stories. These are the Partridge children, Keziah, Sally, and Seth. They're the third, fourth, and fifth children of Oliver and Catherine Knowlton Partridge. And Keziah died at age 3 in 1806. Sally died at age 6 in 1806, 3 days later. And her brother Seth died the same day as his sister Sally, but he was 10 years old. And the remarkable thing about their cause of death was that it put Medfield on the World Health Map.
Sometimes the physicians could be very astute in observing the presentation of diseases and the temporal relationship of how long they would last and that sort of thing, and how they might occur empirically and without all these fancy laboratories that back us up now. And the incidence of spotted fever, including this particularly dramatic impact on this family, was described in the medical journals at the time, and first described from cases coming from this part of the world and from Medfield. The spotted fever, in hindsight, is probably caused by a kind of rickettsia, which is an organism that could cause Rocky Mountain spotted fever and some related spotted fevers. Very evident from their rapid onset and distinctive layout of the skin lesions, of the spots, if you will. First identified here and in this region and described internationally. I would say the cure for it and recognition of its true cause is something that is considerably in the future, maybe 100 years. But often diseases are described clinically way before they are understood mechanistically. The idea that one of them be first emerging here or first recognized in this area is of interest.
For the record, romantically, we often think that epidemics, when you drive past cemeteries such as Long Lake Cemetery, would probably be seen frequently as the reason for the causes of death. The only case in Medfield where you might say an epidemic caused a number of deaths was spotted fever in 1806, when 7 people in Medfield died, most of them children. Another old Medfield name, Simon Chenery, however you pronounce it, died in 1831. We go to the other end of the spectrum now, 76 years old. Once again, he came from a very large family, the last of 10 children, of Ephraim and Hannah Smith Chenery.
The fits. The fits, I would guess, would be epilepsy. And we talked about that some before. But this is descriptive of someone who loses consciousness and has a distinctive movements of their limbs and eyes while they're not conscious. The what brought this fellow to have the fits and how it was his terminal experience is unclear from anything that I can see. Whether he had this his entire life and had some accident, like the fellow who fell down a well, did he choke on his food, or did he have some illness much closer to his 76 years that had as a fellow traveler these fits? We just don't know. Yes.
If he had a high fever and a seizure from the fever, would that be described as the fits?
They could, or they might attribute it to the fever, one or the other. Judgment call as the physician, and sadly gets you into blind lake either way.
The last person that we'll focus on today is the Reverend Joseph Baxter, the son of John and Ann White. He was the beloved second minister of Medfield. His collection of Puritan sermons is considered to be in the top 3 collections of such material in the United States. That collection resides today in the Historical Society, and should you so choose to read it sometime, it will make good bedtime reading.
So the Reverend Baxter lived to 68 years old. So a couple of comments about average ages. And there's statistics, actually, that are kept on this. And what was the average age of everybody in Massachusetts in 1700 and 1750 and 1800? The folks have done this by looking at gravestones and vital records and estimating this fairly accurately. And in this time frame, I don't know the exact average age for men and for women, but it's going to be somewhere around 40 years old, plus minus 35, 40 years old. And a lot of that actually is folding into the averages all these children and the childhood mortality. If you could get by the first 10 years, your lifespan, your surviving, would be much more resonating with modern expectations. The average lifespan for a man now, I think, is 75, 76. Women is in the lower 80s. Right? So there has been increase in longevity in the last 50 years, last century. But the real dramatic gains have been in the largely the elimination of this childhood mortality. So if you get by 10 years old, you can have a pretty good life, and a lot of the stones attest to this. And 68 years old is a pretty good time frame. 1745. So the cause of death, dropsy. What's dropsy?
Liver disease.
What's that?
Liver disease.
Congestive heart failure?
Yes, yes. It's one of these basket kind of descriptions. Dropsy is someone who swells up and can't handle their fluid balance. And they could go on to have problems breathing, they could have problems, have ammonia on their breath, but there's various reasons that we now know and were discovered piecemeal by physicians 100+ years later, that you can have dropsy from liver failure, from heart failure, from kidney failure, causing you to not be able to handle your fluid electrolytes, and as a worst case, untreated, kind of blow up like a balloon and have lots of other systems in your body fail. So dropsy is this basket term for bodies not handling their fluid and presenting visually, very dramatically, as people swelling and hence having difficulty breathing and other difficulties that basically do them in, one or the other do them in, but all having this common pathway of the dramatic swelling. So I don't know whether it was kidney failure or heart failure or liver failure that was behind this, and if it was one of those, why was the kidney, why was the liver, what it was. That would be a modern kind of explanation. But in 1745, this reverend died of dropsy. Not the most common cause of death in that time. I'll recognize it. Okay. A couple of things in conclusion. One is, we've talked about some morbid stuff here, and a couple of observations. One is, my biography of Warren is not all of this. It's about maybe it's a third of medical biography, but it's mostly an American founder's biography. Rousing, battlefield leader, and fellow sending William Dawes and Paul Revere on his ride, politician, inspirational guy. someone that the women thought was very handsome. The medical stuff is just background. I would recommend tracking down my book. I'm very proud of it. You can buy it on Amazon. There's even a couple of copies that the Historical Society have here if you want to purchase it from Rob here. But as a physician, I just want to share this kind of observation. One is, you have this notion of how primitive the old people were. Right? And you can get very self-satisfied about it as a modern person, as a modern physician, and indeed medicine is very advanced in Massachusetts, not only in the United States, but in the world. We're very proud of it. Sometimes we get nostalgic about the old days, especially those of us, not me, who have relatives from the Revolutionary time period, and we can romanticize through the Daughters of the American Revolution, etc., how heroic these times were. And indeed, some aspects of it were just that. However, if you had the choice of getting into a time machine and going back there, this is the kind of stuff you're going to face for yourself and in your family. And worse yet, people don't even take baths very often. It's a huge change in the expectations in Massachusetts to take a bath every week. And that was in the 1840s. What were they doing before that? Don't ask. So when we romanticize the past, and indeed there were heroic things, both in Massachusetts' past, America's past, some of our own families' past, there was also this, the health issues that were mortal so frequently, and in such a sad way, with the children and with others. Then the humbleness of the modern physician. I was basically almost snickering as, fever, what they called fever and dropsy, this heterogeneous basket type of term. I submit that some of the things that we do now in medicine will have my successors 200 years from now snickering at us. I'll give you an example. The incidence of autism is increasing very greatly. Just in the last 20 years. We don't know why. What we do know from epidemiology is that autism seems to be 3 or 4 different diseases who have some common final presentation with children that we call autistic. I suspect that when this knowledge gets discovered and worked out in future generations or centuries, we'll look at what we call autism now as dropsy or fever or fill in the blank, and will be snickering at us. Some of the cancers are like that. Cancer treatments now for a particular kind of cancer may in fact be heterogeneous kinds of cancers, each with their own treatments that might be discovered by analysis of your genome as a routine laboratory test. So right now, and some of us in this room may have gone through it, the kind of treatment with chemotherapy is like a shotgun treatment. This is how we treat. Fill in the cancer. Take out the shotgun, blast it. Hope we kill the cancer before we kill you. That's the kind of thing that 100 and 200 years from now, they'll be laughing at us. Well, thanks so much. You've been such a wonderful audience. Oh, questions? We've kept you overtime. Apologies for that. It's his fault.
When did they stop bleeding people?
Bleeding, which of course, if you have an excess of blood, is the treatment, right? You know why? Because those blood corpuscles that you see under the microscope, when they rub against each other, they cause a big problem, like fever. Like George Washington. He went out, he was riding his horse in 1799, was it? Catches a fever and has a sore throat. Well, obviously, they called in the best physicians in America. Philadelphia at the time, not Boston. And of course, he has an excess of blood, so you bleed him. If the fever doesn't come down, bleed them some more. And those corpuscles are up, bleed them again. Physicians probably killed George Washington. It fell out of favor in the early part of the 19th century. And depending on how close you were as a physician and healthcare professional to the academic institutions, like they stopped doing it earlier than folks who were trained back when and were practicing for decades and had a lot of momentum. In other words, medical knowledge didn't diffuse as fast as it does now, with the exception of inoculation. Jenner and the cowpox things, that went within about 2 or 3 years. That was an exception. So it petered out, and your, beloved family doc out in a place like Medfield was probably doing it a whole lot longer than the folks were in Boston. Other questions? Yes?
You haven't touched on suicide. I heard a talk not long ago that said suicide was a very common cause of death in the 19th century, that without Social Security and all, that this is one of the things the old folks did, or someone with depression and all. You want to comment on that?
Yes,
I question that, but
it's hard to tell. I mean, there might be some anecdotes of some people surviving diaries and things like that. But there was a very strong, and still is some, social kind of stigma to suicide. So even if there was a suicide in a family, hey, let's call it, I don't know, like cover it up, right? And then with death at all ages being a bit more common than what we're used to, maybe it was easier to cover something up. It was that, which makes it difficult to assess. The deliberate covering up of things that could have happened. So did they happen? Who knows? The other thing was that some of these diseases, especially chronic diseases that might have you depressed if you had consumption for years and it was kicking up again and you knew that your family is going to go into debt if you live longer and that kind of thing, some of these people might have hastened their own demise if they knew something was coming. Well, nobody's recording that, but it's conceivable, right? So that the suicides that are recorded are pretty rare. For instance, especially in the 18th century, for instance, there's a record during the siege of Boston that one soldier basically took a gun and shot himself in the head. Was it an accident? Was it suicide? What was it? Yes?
Did they send people with TB to sanatoriums, or was that later?
Sanatoria was sort of a later public health kind of initiative. I think the earliest ones were probably mid-19th century, in full development by late 19th century, and existed all the way until about 1950s. So some people may even know, of your grandparents or something like that who either went to a sanatorium or knew people who did.
Did it work to go?
Well, it did in the sense that it kept, since tuberculosis is mildly infectious, it does have this isolation value of preventing new cases. And I think just the supportive care, instead of living alone or something, and it's not like you have disability insurance and stuff like that. If you're living in the community, you may not be able to work very well, your own nutrition could be bad and stuff. So the idea that you're in an institution that are supporting you, I think had a general positive impact on outcomes, plus this idea of isolation from new cases. So yeah, I think it was effective, but compared...
It didn't cure it.
No, it didn't cure it. But compared to taking pills that would wipe it out, which was the initiative of the spectinomycin type drugs in the early 1950s, was so radical, it just took the need for it and turned it upside down.
Nova just had a good program on.
yes.
Yeah, the Forgotten Plague is what it was called.
So in this time frame, that is the early 19th century and even into the late 18th century, your tuberculosis cases are community dwelling. They're not being isolated. And what with the, this is previous to knowledge of bacteria and infectious diseases on the basis of bacteria, they may have had a false sense of security. In other words, when the knowledge of bacteria and coming out of France and Coke in Germany and stuff like that in the late 19th century kind of spurred on the tuberculosis sanatorium movement, because you knew it would really be good to get these people out of the community as long as they were reasonably taken care of. So that's a late 19th century thing. Any other questions?
I don't know whether or not you'll know this. There was a John Adams series, and I don't know if it's fact or fiction, but do you know what he had? They depicted him as being on his deathbed when he was in Holland doing the treaty.
I know the history behind it. I don't know how it was actually depicted.
But
yes, he was very sick in Holland. But John Adams had been inoculated for smallpox by Joseph Warren, actually, personally. And there's quite amusing section in John Adams' diary where he talks about meeting and befriending Joseph Warren during his inoculation in 1764. So his illness, which was very severe in Holland when he was there as minister in the early 1780s, I don't think it's known for sure what it was. It wasn't smallpox, it wasn't tuberculosis, it was something that he recovered from, and we don't know what.
So was he inoculated separate from his children and wife?
Yes. He was inoculated before he got married to Abigail Smith in 1764. And in fact, he was courting her while he was recovering from the inoculation. Like I say, those letters, which are, I think the Massachusetts Historical Society has them posted online, are actually quite personable, at least for the, when we think of crusty old John Adams, like this is the young, spunky, courting, this really neat girl kind of thing. But he's courting her while he's recovering from the smallpox and has some smallpox inoculation and has some time on his hands. And he actually became fast friends with Joseph Warren coming from this unlikely interaction. So Abigail, I'm not sure when Abigail herself was inoculated, but she had her children inoculated during the Revolutionary War, circa 1776-77, and John Adams was off in the Continental Congress at the time. Yes, sir?
Having survived in youth bacterial spinal meningitis, I wondered if there's any evidence of that back in those colonial days. I survived during an epidemic.
Some of these illnesses that I guessed at could also be consistent. In other words, someone having the fits could have epileptic seizure in the course of an acute infection on the surface membranes of their brain, which is what you fortunately survived. And that is a very severe kind of illness. So what the doctors would see at that time, since they didn't know about checking spinal fluids or anything, they would see someone who would become suddenly ill, have very high fever, and be subject to nausea, vomiting, and epileptic fits. So that's what they'd see. Well, would they call that fever? Would they call that fits? I don't know. But one of the things they didn't call it was meningitis. We do know that there was some treatments, though, for things like meningitis. I think one of the British officers who died early in the siege of Boston has a clinical description that sounds like acute meningitis. And he was prescribed plaster, which is a kind of like medicinal goop that they would often put around broken bones and things like that, around his head, because they thought that he had an acute infection of the brain. So obviously someone was thinking about that kind of thing. Treatment's completely ineffective. I don't want to hold all of you, but I'm going to stick around. Any of you want some books, I will sign them for you. If you want to gab about how lucky we are to live now instead of then so far as these treatments, I'd be happy to speak with you, or just anything you want to talk about. Thanks so much for coming. Rob,
Production support provided by Medfield.tv. Access to our community.